I realized my wife was cheating on me even before I had real proof. But the moment I opened that gift, everything inside me finally broke, and there was no going back, even if I tried to convince myself it was just a stupid coincidence. The hardest part was that part of me had felt for a long time that something was wrong. I just didn't want to admit it for too long, because it was easier to explain everything away as exhaustion, work, stress, and normal changes in a relationship. My birthday was about a week away, and that mattered because I automatically assumed the box I found was my gift. That day I was going to fix an old gas trimmer that hadn't started in weeks, and I needed an extension cord. So I went to the utility room where we kept tools and various junk. It was an absolutely ordinary moment, one of those you don't remember until something inside it breaks your entire reality. The box wasn't in plain sight. It was pushed behind a tool chest, as if someone had deliberately hidden it away, which looked strange, but at the time I didn't think much of it because my birthday was in a week, and the thought that this was a gift for me appeared instantly and without doubt. I even felt a little warmth from it because I thought she was making an effort, that she wanted to surprise me, that she still cared. I opened the box calmly, without feeling like I was doing something wrong, because I was sure it was for me. And it was at that moment that everything changed. Inside lay an expensive fishing set, neatly assembled, clearly not random, with items chosen for someone who was genuinely passionate about it. The problem was that I had nothing to do with this. I don't fish, never have, never plan to, and she knew that better than anyone. I stood there holding that box, trying to understand what was happening. The first feeling wasn't anger or pain, but complete bewilderment. My brain was desperately trying to find any explanation because the simple explanation was too unpleasant. I started going through all possible options in my head, trying to remember if I'd ever said I wanted to try, if there was any moment when she could have misunderstood me. But the longer I thought, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't about me. I closed the box and carefully put it back, trying to place it exactly as it had been so I wouldn't give myself away. But something had already cracked inside. It wasn't an instant realization. It was like the beginning of something that could no longer be stopped. I left the utility room and tried to return to the trimmer, but I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept returning to the same thing. And then, for the first time, I really started looking at her behavior over the past months. Not like before, when everything seemed normal, but attentively, as if I was trying to see what I'd been ignoring all this time. And the more I remembered, the more I understood that she hadn't been the same for a long time. I just hadn't wanted to admit it for too long. She had become more closed off. Before, she could tell me everything, even trivial things, even things that didn't matter, just because she wanted to share. At some point, that disappeared. I can't say exactly when because it happened gradually, but one day I realized she no longer told me anything extra. Only what was necessary. Only on the surface. The phone became a separate issue. She started holding it as if there was something there I shouldn't see. Screen always face down. Quick movements if I happened to be nearby. Leaving the room without explanation. It didn't look like coincidence. It looked like a habit that had already taken root. I remembered how she started staying late at work more often. At the time, it seemed normal. She really did have a heavy workload, projects, deadlines. I didn't ask unnecessary questions because I trusted her. Now it looked different. Not like work, but like something conveniently explained as work. Business trips also started surfacing in my memory. They always sounded logical. There were always explanations, always reasons. I never doubted because there was no reason to. But now, looking at it from a different angle, each such trip started to seem suspicious. The most unpleasant thing was that none of this looked like something new. It wasn't sudden. It was like a process that had been going on for some time. And that thought was truly heavy, because it meant that all this time I'd been living in a reality that possibly had nothing to do with the real one. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I was jumping to conclusions too early, that you can't build such assumptions based on one strange gift and a few observations. But the previous calm was gone inside. Too many small things started adding up into one picture. And at some point, I caught myself thinking that if this gift really wasn't for me, then that meant there was someone else she was preparing it for. And if that someone existed, then this wasn't a coincidence, not a mistake, but something that had already become part of her life. That night I lay next to her and understood that even if I didn't know the full truth yet, I couldn't return to my previous state because doubt had already appeared, and it wouldn't disappear on its own. And worst of all was that deep down, I was already starting to understand that I was most likely not wrong. After the weekend, I returned to work with a heavy feeling inside, as if something had already happened, even though externally everything remained the same. And the first thing I tried to do was pull myself together and convince myself that I was overreacting, that I had worked myself up over one strange find and a set of coincidences that could be explained much more simply if you weren't looking for hidden meaning in them. I deliberately loaded myself with tasks, tried not to return to these thoughts, but they didn't go away. They just waited for me to stop pushing them away. And then, at some point, absolutely suddenly, as if someone flipped a switch, I remembered one detail that had previously seemed like just a funny coincidence, but now suddenly became too important. My boss's birthday was the same day as mine. I didn't remember this immediately. It was like retrieving something from memory that I hadn't paid attention to before, and this memory immediately pulled everything else with it. He was into fishing, not just occasionally going, but really living it. He constantly talked about expensive trips, about popular places that were hard to get to, about tackle, about details I never remembered because I wasn't interested. I always tuned this out because it wasn't about me. But now it stopped being neutral information. And it was at this moment that an unpleasant feeling appeared inside me that I didn't want to formulate. Because if you connect two things, a strange gift that definitely wasn't for me, and a person whose birthday was the same day and who was a perfect match for that gift, the picture started to look too logical, too simple, too unpleasant. I immediately tried to push this away. Told myself it was nonsense, that it was paranoia, that I was just trying to find an explanation where there wasn't one. Life is full of such coincidences, and you don't need to make a tragedy out of them. I literally forced myself to think rationally, dissect each thought and dismiss it, because the alternative was too heavy. But the problem was that along with this memory, other things started surfacing. Over the past 3 months, he had several times brought up the topic of my transfer to another state. Not just discussed it, but really pushed this idea, explaining it as career opportunities, prospects, that it was a step forward. At first, it looked like a normal initiative from a manager who wants to develop employees, and I didn't see anything strange in it. But now it started to look different. This state was maximally remote. Not just another city, but a place where I would have to completely change my life, leave for a long time, practically tear myself out of my familiar environment. And the strangest thing was that he didn't just suggest this once, but returned to it again and again, as if it was important to him that I agreed. I sat at my desk trying to put all this together into one picture, but every time it started to come together, I told myself again that it was nonsense, that I was working myself up, that I was seeing connections where there weren't any, because admitting the opposite would mean admitting too much at once. I started observing him, not openly, not deliberately, but just started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. How he behaved, how he communicated, what topics he raised. I tried to find anything that would confirm or refute my thoughts, but nothing obvious was there. He behaved the same as usual. No drastic changes, no clear signs, and this even calmed me somewhat. I caught myself thinking that maybe I really was overreacting, that it was just a coincidence, that I'd allowed one strange moment to destroy my normal perception of reality. I almost started believing that this was all in my head, that I'd created this problem myself, and now couldn't get rid of it. But this calm didn't last long. It was like a pause before everything crashed down again. That same day, closer to evening, he called me to his office and assigned a task that at first seemed ordinary, but in the next second everything inside me tightened again. He assigned me a business trip, and not just any business trip, but specifically for the dates that coincided with my birthday. At that moment, everything I'd been trying to suppress in myself returned at once. All the thoughts, all the doubts, all the unpleasant coincidences. It was too precise to ignore, too convenient, too timely. I stood and listened to him, nodded, pretended to perceive this as an ordinary work task, but the previous calm was gone inside. Because if before I could write everything off as coincidence, now there were too many of these coincidences. I tried again to convince myself that this was just work, that business trips happen, that dates can coincide, that I was working myself up again. But the previous certainty was gone inside. Now each new coincidence didn't calm me, but instead strengthened the feeling that I was missing something. And the most unpleasant thing was that I started feeling not only anxiety, but also humiliation, as if I was in a situation where everyone already understood everything except me. As if I was the last one to start guessing what was really going on. When I left the office, I had the feeling that reality was starting to slip away. Because on one hand, I still didn't have direct proof. But on the other, too many things started pointing in one direction, and I could no longer just close my eyes to this. At that moment, I understood that either I was really going crazy and creating the problem myself, or I was standing on the threshold of something that would completely destroy everything I considered my life. And worst of all was that I no longer knew which of these options was scarier. By this point, I could no longer just wait and hope everything would somehow clarify itself. Because with each day, the feeling that I was being held in someone else's script only grew stronger, and I understood that if I didn't do something now, I would simply break from this uncertainty. I didn't feel strong or confident. On the contrary, this was a decision born of desperation, from the desire to at least grab onto something, because living in this state had become impossible. I convinced a colleague, with whom I had a normal relationship, essentially a work friend, to fly on that business trip instead of me that was assigned for my birthday dates. This wasn't easy. I had to explain it as a personal situation, without details, pressing that it was really important for me to stay, that I would make up for everything later, take on any tasks, do extra. He didn't agree immediately, but in the end it worked out. And at the moment when he confirmed he would go, a strange feeling appeared inside me, a mixture of relief and anxiety, because now I had no excuse to do nothing. I decided that I would check everything myself, not through conversations, not through guesses, but directly. And that's why I rented a pickup truck, so I wouldn't use my own car, so I wouldn't be visible, so I wouldn't leave traces, because even then I understood that if I was wrong, there would be no way back, and if I was right, even more so. On the first day, I started with him. This seemed logical because if my suspicions made any sense, then the connection should show at least in behavior. I followed him from a distance, trying not to attract attention, and everything looked so normal that I even felt irritation at myself. He went home to his apartment, spent time there, then went to the gym, worked out as usual, without any deviations, without nervousness, without fuss, as if nothing at all was happening in his life. Later in the evening, he met friends at a bar, and this looked so mundane that at some point I had the feeling that I was doing complete nonsense. I sat in the car, watched all this, and felt doubt in myself starting to rise inside. Because if this was all true, if he was really involved in something, then why was he behaving so calmly, so confidently, so normally? I started thinking that maybe I really was overreacting, that I'd connected things that had no relation to each other, that I'd allowed one strange find to destroy my normal perception of reality. At that moment, I even felt a little ashamed of what I was doing, of the fact that I'd resorted to surveillance, that I was ready to destroy my life based on guesses. And it was in this state, when I was already starting to doubt my venture, that I decided to check on her, just to finally calm down, just to put a period and return to normal life if there was nothing there. I drove to the house and stopped so I could see the windows. And at some point, I saw her. She was in the room trying on a dress. Red. I immediately understood this was something new because I'd never seen it before. It looked expensive, not just an ordinary purchase, but something bought for a specific occasion with a definite purpose. And at that moment, something tightened inside me again. Because I knew our finances. I knew how much we spent, how much we saved, what our possibilities were, and this dress didn't fit into that picture. I couldn't have just bought such a thing without noticing it in the budget, and neither could she. I watched this through the window and felt that same feeling returning that I'd had when I opened that box. This wasn't just suspicion. This was the understanding that there was a piece of reality hidden from me. And the longer I watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't a coincidence. She was trying on this dress not like someone trying on an ordinary thing. This looked like preparation, as if she already knew where and why she would wear it. And this made it even worse because at that moment I finally understood that this wasn't just about the gift, not just about coincidences, not just about my guesses. I sat in the car and for the first time stopped trying to calm myself, because at that moment it became too obvious that something was happening. I still didn't know the full truth. I still didn't have direct proof, but there was no longer room inside for the previous excuses. And the most unpleasant thing was that along with this understanding came another. This wasn't the first day. This wasn't something new. This had already become part of her life, just not mine. And at that moment, something changed inside me. I stopped being a person who just doubts and tries to find an explanation. I became a person who wants to know the full truth, even if that truth destroys everything he has. My birthday came, and this was the first time this date ceased to have any normal meaning for me, because instead of anticipation or at least a calm day, there was only one thing inside me. Today, everything will become completely clear. I woke up with a heavy feeling, without hope, without illusions, as if I already knew how it would end. But I still had to see it with my own eyes, because without that, I couldn't move forward. I started following her from early morning, and the first hours showed that this day had nothing to do with me. She went to a spa, and this looked not like a random decision, but like preparation. Then a beauty salon, and this strengthened the feeling that all this was planned in advance, that this wasn't impulse, not spontaneity, but a clear plan. I watched this from the side and felt everything tightening inside because this day should have been about me. But in her reality, I wasn't in it. After the salon, she returned home and the waiting began. These hours were the hardest because I already understood that something would happen, but didn't know exactly when. I just sat and waited, and with each minute the tension grew stronger, and then it happened. My boss's car pulled up to the house. At that moment, there were no more doubts inside, no attempts to calm myself. This was confirmation of everything I'd been trying to deny. I looked at that car and understood that now something would happen, after which there would be no way back. She came out of the house a few minutes later, in that same red dress. Everything looked as if this was absolutely normal, as if she wasn't doing anything that was destroying my life. She approached the car, got in, and they drove away. I followed them, not thinking, not analyzing, just following. Inside, there was no longer chaos. There was cold clarity that comes when everything becomes too obvious. They stopped at a restaurant, an expensive one, the kind I'd never go to because it simply wasn't my level. I looked at this place and felt something heavy rising inside because this wasn't just dinner. This was their celebration. On my birthday, they got out of the car and went inside, calmly, confidently, without the slightest hint of doubt, as if this was how it should be. I waited about 15 minutes so I wouldn't go right after them, so I wouldn't look like a person running after the truth, even though that's exactly what I was doing. Then I approached the entrance, and they simply didn't let me in. without aggression, without rudeness, just as a fact. I didn't meet their requirements. Appearance, format of the establishment, some internal rules. I stood there in a tracksuit, unshaven, and at that moment, this became another blow. Because inside was my wife, with another man, in a place where they didn't even consider me worthy of entering. This was maximum humiliation. Not just infidelity, but a situation where you're literally put below everyone around. I walked around the building and started looking for another entrance. This was no longer a rational decision. This was a state where you can't stop. And I found a back entrance. One of the waiters came out to smoke, and at the moment when the door was left ajar, I didn't just walk inside. I ran. I literally burst inside, not thinking about consequences, not thinking about how it looked, because at that moment there was only one goal for me, to see them and stop this. I ended up in the hall and immediately saw them. They were sitting at a table, calmly, as if this was their normal life, as if I'd never existed. And at that moment, everything stopped. They looked up and saw me. There was shock on their faces. Real, sharp, unprepared. And this was the first time in all this that I saw them uncertain. The live music abruptly died down. People started turning around. The entire hall seemed to freeze, and in this silence I felt everything that had been building up inside me break out. I started shouting, not choosing words, not filtering, not thinking about who heard me. I spoke about betrayal, about how long this had been going on, about what they'd done. This wasn't a performance. This was a complete breakdown. I saw how people around looked, some with surprise, some with awkwardness, some already with understanding. But I didn't care. Security appeared quickly. They grabbed me, started dragging me away, but I kept shouting because this was the only moment when I could say everything that had accumulated. And as they were pulling me out of the hall, I understood one thing. I no longer doubt. Because now these aren't guesses. These aren't coincidences. This is reality that I saw with my own eyes. And from this moment, you can't go back. They threw me out onto the street quickly and without extra conversation, as if I was something that just needed to be removed from sight so as not to spoil the atmosphere. And at some point I found myself on the sidewalk, sitting, not quite understanding how exactly I got there, because everything inside was still buzzing from what happened a few minutes ago. Everything was too sharp, too loud, too final, and when the ordinary noise returned around me, I felt a strange emptiness, as if the sound had simply been turned off inside. I sat and looked ahead, not trying to get up, not trying to do anything, because at that moment I had neither strength nor meaning to move. Everything I considered my life had ended literally in one evening. And this wasn't gradual destruction, but a blow after which nothing remains to return to. I felt neither tears nor hysteria, only some heavy realization that now everything would be different. And there was no way back. After some time, the restaurant door opened, and they came out. I saw them immediately because I was waiting for this, though I wouldn't admit it to myself. They looked different now, not like people caught off guard, but like those who had already made a decision and were just bringing everything to an end. She approached closer, and I looked at her, trying to find at least something familiar, at least something from that life we had. But it wasn't there. Before me stood a person who, essentially, I no longer knew. And what she said next was even worse than everything I'd seen before. She said I was a loser. This was said calmly, without emotion, as a fact that had long been obvious to her. And this hit harder than screams or accusations, because there was no impulse in these words. There was a position. Then she said that at first, all this was for my promotion. That it started as a way to help me, as some kind of arrangement, as a solution that, in her opinion, should have benefited us both. And at that moment, everything inside me turned over again, because this meant I was part of this story, without even knowing it. She spoke further, and each word only strengthened the feeling that everything I considered reality was built on something else. She said that over time, everything changed. That it stopped being just a way to get something, that she started feeling something more for him, and that now she wants to leave. She wasn't shouting, wasn't making excuses, wasn't trying to soften the blow. She simply stated this as a decision that had already been made and wasn't subject to discussion. I listened to this and felt everything rising inside me at once: anger, humiliation, shame, pain. Not just from the fact of infidelity itself, but from how it was done. From the fact that I was used, that I was kept in the dark, that my life was built into someone else's scheme where I was just an element. And the hardest thing was that part of what she said sounded too logical to simply dismiss. Because yes, over the past months my career had indeed gone up. Yes, I was getting opportunities I hadn't thought about before. Yes, it all looked like the result of my work, but now it looked different. And this was another destruction, not just of the relationship, but of the feeling that I had achieved something myself. I looked at her and understood that before me stood a person who had made their choice. Not now, not at this moment, but much earlier. And everything happening now was just the finale that had to happen. At some point I realized I had nothing to say. Not because I agreed, but because any words would no longer change anything. Everything had already happened. They left. Simply turned around and left, leaving me sitting there where I'd been thrown out. And this was the quietest moment of the entire day. Without screams, without scenes, without witnesses. I was left alone. And then came the true understanding of what happened. Not in a flash, not in drama, but slowly. That now I didn't have that life I was used to. That I didn't have the person I considered close. That I didn't have certainty that what I did had meaning. But along with this came another feeling. Strange, heavy, but in some sense, clear. Because for the first time in a long while, I knew exactly where the lie ends. I didn't know what to do next. Didn't know how to build a life after this. Didn't know if I could ever trust anyone again. And the most unpleasant thing was that I didn't have a feeling of justice or completion. Because formally, everything looked as if she simply made a choice. As if this was her right. As if I should accept this and move on. But inside remained a question to which I still don't have an answer. If a person first justifies betrayal by saying it's for you, and then continues it for themselves, where exactly is the line after which it stops being a justification and becomes what it was from the very beginning? And if that line even exists at all?